Imagine this. You arrive at your parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Everything seems normal. The table set, the typical kitchen smells, the warmth of the family. But what if I told you that in that very house a nightmare was brewing? A nightmare written step by step in a notebook. A son, an ordinary man, plotted to turn his own parents into a chemical experiment. Not out of apparent hatred, not out of passing madness, but with absolute coldness, to seize an inheritance. When the police arrived, what they found was so inhuman, so indescribable, that some called it the Tennessee House of Horrors. This isn't just a murder story. It's the most brutal betrayal that can exist. The monster didn't come from outside. The monster was in the house. Joel Guy Jr., the son who turned his home into a house of horrors. The family, the plan, and the hidden monster. A quiet town in Tennessee. A seemingly ordinary family home, filled with memories, photographs, and dreams. A son returning home for Thanksgiving. But what happened within those walls was so monstrous that police called it the most disturbing crime scene of his career. This is the story of Joel Guy Jr., a man who was supposed to be a son, but chose to be an executioner. A murderer who turned his parents' inheritance into a motive to create his own laboratory of horror. The Guy family. The Guys were a hard-working family. Joel Guy Sr. was a kind, helpful man, known in his community as upright and respected. His wife, Lisa Guy, was a sweet, protective woman, devoted to her home and her children. Both had worked hard all their lives. They had an older son, Joel Michael Guy Jr., born in 1988. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary young man, withdrawn and shy. But beneath that appearance lurked a dark abyss. The son who never grew up. Joel Jr. never became independent. While his friends studied, worked, and started their own families, he remained dependent on his parents. At 28, he was still supported by Joel Sr. and Lisa, who paid for absolutely everything: housing, tuition, food, and health insurance. An eternal child, trapped in an adult's body. A son who never cut the cord, but used it to strangle the dreams of those who gave him life. The parents' decision. In 2016, Joel Sr. and Lisa decided to retire. They planned to move to a new home and begin a quiet life after decades of work. That retirement also meant something else, no longer financially supporting their son. That simple, logical decision lit the spark of hell. Joel Jr. knew his comfortable life would come to an end, and in his sick mind, that decision wasn't just a change, it was a betrayal. It was a sentence, and he decided to respond with another sentence. Death. The monster's plan. Joel Jr. began to plan. It wasn't a fit of rage, but something cold and meticulous. In his apartment, the police would later find a notebook, a macabre diary. Within its calmly written pages, Joel had outlined step by step what he would do. Kill Mom first, so Dad wouldn't defend her. Use large knives, make sure they were sharp. Dismember the bodies so they couldn't be identified. Use chemicals, acid, bleach to dissolve the flesh. It wasn't a flash of rage. It was a script written in detail, as if it were a scientific experiment. Coming home. Thanksgiving 2016 arrived. Joel Jr. traveled to Knoxville to spend the weekend at his parents' house. The atmosphere seemed festive, like any other families. Dinner, laughter, memories. But while Lisa set the table and Joel Sr. talked about retirement, his son was thinking about something else. The house he grew up in would soon be his laboratory, and his parents would be his first victims. The first attack. On November 26th, Lisa Guy was the first. While she was alone in the kitchen, Joel attacked her with large knives, causing brutal wounds. It was a swift, calculated, vicious attack. Joel Sr., hearing the commotion, rushed to defend his wife. But his son was ready. She stabbed him repeatedly, with a violence that can only be described as inhuman. That day, the Guy house ceased to be a home and became a slaughterhouse. The dehumanization. But the worst wasn't the death. The most chilling thing came later. With surgical calm, Joel Jr. began to dismember his parents' bodies. He placed them in bathtubs, buckets, and pots. He prepared a chemical mixture to dissolve them, trying to erase all traces of humanity from those who had raised him. The smell of chemicals began to permeate the house, an unbearable stench, a mixture of acid and death. Days later, the police would describe the scene as one of the most repulsive they had ever seen. The mistake that gave him away. Joel thought he'd thought it all out, but he made a fatal error. Lisa Guy had a steady job, and her absence from the office immediately raised suspicions. When she didn't show up for work the following Monday, her colleagues called the police to check on her well-being. The officers arrived at the house, and what they found was a living hell. The house of horrors. The smell was the first thing. A nauseating chemical stench escaping through the cracks in the house. Upon entering, the officers discovered the scene. Dismembered human remains in buckets. Decomposing bones in a bathtub filled with acid. Pots on the stove with unrecognizable fragments. A makeshift laboratory for undoing the lives of two human beings. But the most chilling thing was Joel Jr.'s notebook found in a drawer. A plan written coldly, as if it were a macabre recipe. The arrest. Joel Jr. was arrested shortly after, with overwhelming evidence against him. During interrogations, he never showed remorse. His gaze was blank, his voice calm, his demeanor distant. Investigators described him as incapable of empathy, a son who, instead of tears, offered chemical formulas and cold calculations. The fear that remained. The community was forever scarred. How was it possible for a son to murder his parents in such an inhumane way? How could someone transform his childhood home into a laboratory of death? Neighbors described Joel Jr. as a quiet, strange, but never dangerous young man. No one imagined that behind that silence lurked a monster. The trial, the notebook, and the true face of the monster. The discovery. The house was no longer a home. Each room revealed a scene more grotesque than the last. In the kitchen, officers found pots on the stove. Inside them, something unrecognizable, until they confirmed the impossible. Human remains boiling in chemicals. In the bathrooms, buckets and bathtubs contained dismembered parts. The chemicals still bubbled slowly, as if the killer had been preparing a formula. But what chilled the investigators the most was the notebook found in a drawer. The macabre diary. In its pages, written in neat handwriting, Joel Jr. had left a record of what he planned to do. A list of steps that seemed straight out of a horror manual. Kill Mum first, to surprise her. Turn off the alarm so no one hears the screams. Boil body parts to separate the flesh from the bones. Store bones in chemicals so they slowly dissolve. Wait for the bodies to decompose before fleeing. These weren't just scribbles. It was a plan written with surgical precision, devoid of emotion, as if it were an experiment. The evidence was devastating. Not only had he committed the crime, he'd planned it for weeks. The cold arrest. Joel Jr. was found in his apartment days later. The police burst in, expecting resistance, but found him calm, almost indifferent. There was no trace of panic or regret on his face. His gaze was cold, steady, distant. When they informed him that his parents had been found, he showed no surprise. As if he already knew everything would come to light. This absolute detachment terrified even the most experienced investigators. The court process. The trial began in 2020, 4 years after the crime. The courtroom was packed. Family members, neighbors, journalists. Everyone wanted to hear how the son who had devastated his own parents was exposed. The prosecutor presented the evidence. The photographs of the crime scene. The remains found in buckets and pots. Joel Jr.'s diary, written word for word. The entire courtroom held its breath as excerpts were read aloud. The jury's reaction, as the images were projected and the diary pages were read, the jury watched Joel Jr. They expected tears, nerves, some sign of humanity. But all they saw was a motionless, emotionless man, calmly observing every detail, as if he weren't his parents, as if it were just a lesson repeated in his mind. One of the jurors would later describe the experience as looking into the void in the shape of a person. The chilling testimony. Investigators who came to the house were called to testify. One of them confessed, "I've seen hundreds of crime scenes, but never anything like this. It was like walking into a laboratory in hell. The smell, the images. It was impossible to get them out of your head." Another officer described how the chemicals were still bubbling on the stove, as if the killer had left it only minutes before. The courtroom fell silent. It was impossible to ignore the magnitude of the horror, the psychological profile. Criminal psychology experts tried to explain Joel Jr. Some described him as a man with extreme antisocial and narcissistic traits. Others as someone unable to see his parents as human beings, but as obstacles in his life. His motivation seemed clear: the inheritance money, the end of financial support, and a hidden resentment that grew into deadly hatred. A cold hatred without screaming or rage, only calculation. The verdict. After weeks of trial, the jury didn't take long to decide. The evidence was incontrovertible. Joel Guy Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. His sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, the courtroom waited for some reaction. A tear, a scream, something. But Joel Jr. remained impassive, with the same blank expression on his face as from the beginning. The impact on the community Knoxville was scarred by this crime. Neighbors who once greeted Joel Jr. on the street couldn't believe that the shy boy they knew was capable of such barbarity. The house where it all happened was called the House of Horrors, a place that seemed normal but hid an indescribable hell within. Even years later, many claim that the mere memory of the chemical smell never faded from their memories. The son who ceased to be human. The story of Joel Guy Jr. is not just a crime. It is the ultimate betrayal, the son who murders those who created him. But beyond the horror, what is most frightening is his coldness. The fact that he planned everything like a project, that he wrote it in a notebook as if it were a shopping list, that he never showed a hint of remorse. The monster didn't scream. The monster didn't roar. The monster simply planned. The legacy of horror. Today, Joel Guy Jr. is serving his prison sentence. But his story continues to send chills down the spines of every corner of the world. Because this isn't about an unknown serial killer, nor a stranger who comes in the night. This is about a son who was supposed to protect and care for his parents, and who turned them into a chemical experiment. His crime reminds us of a terrifying truth. Evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes the true monster is born at home.